Welcome to the village. I'm honored to have as my co-host today Bob Cudmore, who is a historian and Amsterdam native. Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Well, it's good to be with you, and I'm excited about your podcast.
Yes, thank you for the support. So I will give a little introduction about who Bob is for those of you that don't know him. He has and continues to have an extensive career in broadcast, literature, and history. He's been a pillar of the community in upstate New York, which is why I'm eager to speak to him, because I think it's important for our community, especially our children, to learn their roots and take pride in how they got to be where they are today.
Mm-hmm.
And thanks to Bob, we have that opportunity. He's described as the voice of the Mohawk Valley by a fellow historian who wrote the foreword for his book, Stories from the Mohawk Valley, which is one of the 4 books he's written, right, Bob?
Yes, 4 books, 3 history books, 1 was a humor book.
Yes. Is that the one about Nero?
Yep.
And besides books, he's also written weekly columns for the Daily Gazette and the Amsterdam Recorder.
That's true.
Yes, and he's also well known for his radio shows. He had a show on WVTL, and prior to that, his nighttime talk show called Contact.
Mm-hmm.
He's also produced documentaries such as Historic Views of Carpet City.
Mm-hmm.
I picked that up from the Walt Elwood Museum last week. And he's also been a professor at the College of St. Rose in the Department of Communications. Because of his historic research and his philanthropy, he was awarded the Herbert T. Singer Community Service Award by the Montgomery County Chamber of Commerce, which is given to New York State residents who have distinguished themselves in their community through selfless dedication and service. So I could go on and take the whole podcast talking about just what you've done, but we can jump over to what you're doing now. Right now, you do have The Historians as your weekly podcast.
Yes.
Your big project now is the podcast, The Historians.
Yes, and I'm kind of slowing down. I'm 77, so.
Yeah, good for you. That's great.
Right.
It's just slow down at some point, right?
That's right.
Some of us slow down in our 40s. Right? So let's talk about The Historians. As the name implies, you talk to historians, but there's more than that too, though, right?
Yeah, I come up with different ideas. It's an interview podcast, much as this is with you. For example, what I recorded earlier today was an interview with a woman named Kate Fagan, and she's a sports reporter. She's done a book on the history of women's basketball. Did you play basketball?
I didn't. They forced us to in gym class.
See, well, I didn't realize it when I set up the interview. The name was sort of familiar to me, but she's from here. I mean, she lives now in South Carolina. She has worked for ESPN-W, which deals with women's sports, and Sports Illustrated, wrote a very touching book about a young woman who took her own life. In fact, you kind of bring that up at the end of our conversation, according to your notes. Somebody that people thought had everything together, as they say, but this young woman at age 19 took her own life. Kate Fagan wrote a bestseller about that. But anyway, how did I get to Kate Fagan? Well, her publicist pitched me and other people on having her on, and I was pleasantly surprised that, again, she's from up here. She was born in Schenectady.
Wow.
And went to Niskayuna schools and so forth. So I have to come up with a guest or something like it every week. And I have to come up with a column every week. And so
yes, like this young woman you spoke to today, there's a variety of accomplished people you speak to.
Yes. I mean, for example, the other day I spoke with them. A lot of them are authors, like the lady I talked to today, Kate Fagan, is an author. Earlier this month, I talked to a man named Alan Mattis, who wrote a book about the crash of an American jet bomber up in the Adirondacks, which occurred in 1962. And he did extensive research on it. He's a local researcher. I have an attorney down in New York City that I've interviewed a number of times named Jim Kaplan. We call him our New York City correspondent.
Oh, good.
We talked about people associated with New York City, such as Alexander Hamilton and other people like that. And then I'll often interview people in towns in New York State. Like I just spoke with the president of the Historical Society in Beacon, New York, which is just outside the city.
Yeah.
And it's known now for its art museum, Beacon. And it's not their museum. It's a nonprofit foundation. But we like to find out about different things in history. So it's a variety of topics.
You spoke to, I think it was a researcher. She was talking about the glaciers.
Yeah.
And that's, just an important topic that people should know about. It was really interesting.
Yeah, and it's terrible. I'm blanking on her name. This happens with advanced age, but she's also spoken at the Amsterdam Free Library. I do a lot of work, some volunteer work with the library or helping them put on different programs. And she spoke there, and she lives here in upstate New York.
Actually, because you mentioned the library, that's how I met you recently. When is the word losing your words can start in your 40s, right? It doesn't.
Yeah.
The Amsterdam Free Library, the Amsterdam Reads program.
Right.
When we spoke about women in medicine, and you were the moderator for the panel. So.
No, that was very interesting to me. And we're talking to several of the physicians, including yourself. Most of them were, as you are, a pediatrician.
Yes, that's when we talked a lot about that fact, too, how, women in medicine and what we do today versus what we weren't allowed to do. And that was a historical fiction book that it was kind of based on, The Girl in His Shadow. That was neat. Like some of these authors you speak to are also historical fiction authors.
Yes,
too.
I do quite a bit with the authors of historical fiction. And so it's a variety of things. I'm always looking for ideas.
Okay, good. You went to Amsterdam High School, then you went to Boston University. That's where you achieved your bachelor's and master's in English.
Yes.
Throughout this entire journey, starting in high school, you've been in radio.
Yes, I started working in radio at age 16, I think. Yeah. Maybe to anticipate your question that you had sent me about it. That's young, but it's almost typical of people of my generation, especially the males. A lot of us started in radio real early because it was, I don't know, like having model trains or something. Yeah. We were just interested in radio. I mainly just liked listening to the radio. Okay. And the radio I listened to was WCSS, the Amsterdam station. And then they had an audition for a Sunday announcer among students from Amsterdam High. Oh, and so I took the audition, came in second, but the guy who came in first didn't want it. So that's how I got started in radio.
Maybe he just wanted to see if he could win.
Well, yeah, it could be, or I don't know what. He's done very well. I even know his name. His name is Steve Ferris. He became an attorney, very successful attorney. Okay. The joke, I go to a sort of kind of monthly gathering of old radio and TV people. The point about radio is you don't make any money.
Okay.
It's very, or in general, or much money. But it's something that you love doing.
You can tell you do love doing it. A lot of what you've written and you continue to write and talk about is local or the Mohawk Valley, Amsterdam in particular, and your love for the region comes through. That actually brings me into the next thing. You are a historian, correct? So,
well, I don't know. Sort of I'm more like a history storyteller. Okay. I've never been trained as a historian. I didn't major in that field in college.
Right.
But I've always been interested in it.
So is that why that was actually part of the question too of, you do present to us a lot of history through your broadcasting. So how is it because of your love of history, or how did the connection between radio and broadcast incorporate?
Well, to tell you the truth, one of the big pushes I had to do history came from a gentleman, and I hope I remember his name, I think it's Don Rogeson, who was the general manager of the public TV station, WMHT. I had to, by then, this is talking the late 1990s. And he was interested in me because I was from the area. I was born in Amsterdam, and to some extent knew a fair amount about it. I was going to say a lot about it, but, I don't want to brag so much. And so he knew that I had an interest in Amsterdam and knew some topics up there. Mm-hmm. And he had me do some interviews for the TV station with people like my old late friend Sam Zerlo, who you probably never met or maybe even heard of, but he was a reporter for the Daily Gazette in Amsterdam and also did radio and on WCSS. So anyway, I did that. And then Mr. Rogerson said he'd like to see me working on the documentary. Okay. See, WMHT did a series of these documentaries about local towns. Okay. And they had a producer or a producing director named Steve Dunn, who was very good at it. And so Rogerson got me to work with Dunn. We didn't get along at first too well, but we eventually did. And we produced Carpet City. And we went all out. I mean, it took us a year to produce Carpet City. And when it debuted, which was in the year 2000, it really was a big hit, in Amsterdam specifically. Yeah. Some people didn't like our emphasis one thing or another, but in general, so many people watched it, and that kind of got me into history. And in fact, it led me to go to the Daily Gazette and say, I've now got this reputation as a historian. Yeah. Maybe I could write a history column. Okay. And they said, okay. And I've been doing the history column once a week longer than I've done anything else in media. Yeah. And by that, I mean, it's been over 20 years. Yeah. I mean, usually a media job has certain time limits. Like I was at the big station I was at, WGY, for 13 years. But with the Gazette, I've been there longer than that. Not to say that it won't end. It will end one way or another, but I'm still doing it.
Yeah, and people still read and need the newspaper. Yeah. So.
Well, yes, they newspapers have their own issues these days, and it may be hard to find material sometimes, but I do get a lot of input from the community because it's in the newspaper.
Right, yeah. That documentary was fantastic. It was actually Ann Piccone told me they used to run it in the background when they had these programs in the museum, and so people could watch it when they were in the museum.
Tell you the truth, Mawash, and you expressed interest in it, and it's always there, to me, that we've done the documentary. It's been over 20 years since it's been out, and I thought, well, right now I have the idea I'd like to show it again, but I have to get permission from WMHT because I don't own it. My former colleague, Steve, doesn't own it. The TV station owns the rights to it. And so I have to see if they're willing to let me do it and what their terms would be. But I could see running it again because I think it's historic in its own right because it was made over 20 years ago.
Right, yeah.
So that's the past.
It is, but it's still very relevant, and you presented in the documentary the different cultures. So you talked about, the history of Amsterdam and how it came to have the success it did, the mill town. And then you talked about the people and the culture. So you showed a lot of things that are still relevant today. So I think it's important for people who live in the region.
Yeah. And as time goes on, more and more of the people we interviewed have passed away. Yeah. Not all of them, or maybe not even the majority of them, but some of the speakers that we had on the documentary, such as Tony Merdico, who was a union leader. He's passed away, but we have Tony Merdico on this recording. Catherine Strobeck, who was a historian of Amsterdam, specifically maybe with an emphasis on the south side of the city. And, and other people that we talked to for the documentary and we put in the documentary are gone.
That's what, like you said, it's also a historical documentary too. Maybe even doing a new one. What do you think?
Oh, I would, but I don't think there's any interest in it in terms of WMHT is not doing that kind of programming right now. Or, I'm probably too old to go traipsing around like I did with Steve, doing... Yeah. Stand-ups on Bell Hill. Yeah. Have you come across Bell Hill?
No.
It's this very steep hill that goes from Reed Hill down to the East End. And he had me standing there as cars are going by.
Yeah.
Doing all this TV stuff, which I'm really not that used to. I've done a little TV over the years, but that was probably my baptism of fire in terms of doing television.
Yeah, so it's more about our area because you did grow up in Amsterdam. Your father came here when he was 3, so they took
And you came to this country when you were 3.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and I started in New York too, but on Long Island, so a little south of here. But seems like New York is the place to start at age 3.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah.
Could be, yeah.
So but your family came right to Amsterdam.
Yes, at least on my father's side. My mother's side was a different story. They were here longer. Their name was Cook, my mother's name, but my father's people, the Cudmores, came to Amsterdam for 2 reasons. They had a relative in Amsterdam. My grandfather's sister, Beatrice, already lived here when Harry, who was my grandfather, came over. But also, he, in a sense, was recruited by one of the mills.
Oh.
A lot of the English were immigrants, the way Italians and Puerto Ricans and whatnot were also immigrants to Amsterdam. The English also, in general, owned the mills, but that wasn't my father's people. So my grandfather was a weaver, and so he was brought over not to work in the carpet mills, but to work in an Amsterdam glove mill, which was Founds Brothers, and he used to weave silk, and that's how it began that we moved here. Or our family moved here.
Okay. And that's what your father did, too?
My father became a carpet weaver.
Okay.
He had first had a job at General Electric, which probably would have been a better deal over time. But he was laid off in the Depression.
Okay.
And then, and I can't say it doesn't hurt to be English in Amsterdam, with the owners of the mill being basically of English origin. I said that to my father once when he was old and in the nursing home. I said, Dad, how did you get a job in the carpet mill in Mohawk Carpets in the Depression? He said, because I'm English.
Oh.
And he was good at it, but I mean, it helped that he knew the people and they knew him and they hired him.
So your dad, he worked at Mohawk Mills.
Yes.
And so they were English, that was the Shuttleworth family?
That's right. They were immigrants themselves. The original Shuttleworth brothers came from somewhere in England. I want to say it might have been Kidderminster.
Okay.
My father's people, we came from Devon, which is the west end of England, near Wales. In fact, many of my relatives now over there live in Wales.
You are in touch with your English roots?
Somewhat. We went through a period like maybe... It was back in the 90s that we really picked up with those folks. And I still get one Christmas card a year from one of my cousins over there.
Neat.
But in general, all through our time, the Cudmore time in Amsterdam, the family did stay in touch with England, maybe especially during the war years.
Yeah.
I wasn't born yet, but they said how they would send packages to them, because they were having it worse than we were having it. In the war.
True. Actually, so when you bring up this topic of your father, getting the job he did, being English, so in Amsterdam, even today, do we feel that we are all kind of mixed together in all the different cultures in Amsterdam, but you can still see like the individual cultures in Amsterdam, right? So there's Italian, Polish.
Right. No, all of them have had unique contributions, wonderful customs and so forth. Well, when I was little, I lived on Reed Hill, it was called. At the time, it was primarily a Polish settlement. I would say now it's more Latino, and probably some Polish families are still there, but we were unusual. It was unusual that my family wasn't Catholic. We were Protestants. But I love the Polish people. I feel very close to them. And some of the people I still stay in touch with are the Polish folks from Reed Hill. In fact, maybe another good candidate for your podcast is a man who's a bit younger than I, David Petrusha, who wrote a book about Amsterdam. And he is of Polish origin, lived over the bar, as people did, over a tavern.
Yeah.
Which was the tavern run, I think, by his uncle. And he has a lot of great stories about growing up on Reed Hill. I have my own stories. But then over time, I know my father was very friendly with a lot of Italian Americans.
Yeah.
In in the mill, and the Lithuanians, and then again the Latinos have come in. And since then, we've had the Chinese or the people from Hong Kong, the Buddhist folks who've come. So it's always been an immigrant place.
Yes,
Amsterdam.
it seems to be like much of this area, a lot of places in New York seem to be a place for people to come and there's hope, there's a new life people come to for betterment. I think that's where the Puerto Ricans came in too, for better opportunities. And I think you said for peace too. So to get away from cities and things like that.
Yes, that's another thing. For example, with the Latino immigration, and primarily Puerto Rican, one of the people we interviewed is Susan Doria, who did her anthropology doctorate on Amsterdam.
Yes.
And the clash of cultures when the carpet mills moved out, which really was the time that the Latinos moved in, because they were willing to work in the mills that were replacing the carpet mills that didn't pay as much money. Yeah, but that was a time of great change in Amsterdam as well.
She's the one, now I don't know if this was her direct quote or she quoted someone, but she had said, everyone wants the same thing, a nice place to live and economic security.
Exactly.
Right?
In fact, I'd forgotten the point I was going to make with Susan. Susan said that initially the Puerto Rican immigration had to do with economics. They were looking for these jobs up here. But then, as you had said, they came for what they said in Spanish as tranquilidad, that this was a better place to be than the South Bronx.
Yeah.
Let's say.
Yeah, precisely. Everyone wants like safety, security. Like we're a lot more similar than we think or realize.
Yeah, but that's a hard thing. And in Amsterdam, there are a lot of rough edges. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
People don't get along all the time.
That's a good point you bring up, because growing up in Amsterdam and having these different areas, so economically it was quite different, and culturally there was a lot of diversity then too, as there are now. You were friends with a variety of the kids, but was there difficulty within the cultures to get along?
Yes. But on the other hand, we got along one way or another,
Yeah, you've figured it out. Was there like bullying and fights and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't like, people are always, as you get older, it's like you think that the current crop of kids is really going, as the expression is, to hell in a handbasket.
Yeah.
And maybe that's true. I mean, you deal with young children all the time now, I would think, as a pediatrician. But I have no, so to say, experience with that. My children never had children, for example. Okay. So I haven't seen the problems that affect young people today.
Yeah. Well, Jen, like you said, I mean, maybe the way we look at the children and the problems they have today, maybe they had different problems at different times.
It seems there's this whole crop of new problems, or problems that we either swept under the rug in the Carpet City or worked out. For example, autism. I don't think I ever heard of autism when I was a young person. Yeah,
diagnosing more things, or there's more people with it. That's still a good question. And things were treated differently before. So speaking a little more, because I just found it interesting, like when I am going on my 9th year working in Amsterdam, and you really want to go do your work and then you drive home. And I lived in Albany for quite a while. It was a commute, so you don't really stop to really think too much. But I did start thinking more, and it is pretty obvious as you drive through Amsterdam. There's a lot of these big buildings. There's a lot of older looking architecture, and there's many different parts of the city. It did look like there was once something, I guess you could say, more thriving. There was industry.
Yeah. And the people of my age and younger are very sad about that, or mad.
Yeah.
It's gone to, but it's happened all over the Northeast anyway, or we aren't the only city that's got empty buildings and strife between different ethnic groups and so forth. I keep looking for the silver lining, I suppose, but I am told that Amsterdam's population has gone up somewhat.
Yeah.
It has some new industries. Or the one thing I think is remarkable, I hear about this place, Sticker Mule,
Yes.
which I think has succeeded noteworthy, which was a kind of a replacement to the carpet mills and such. But people don't need litter bags and things that Noteworthy made. So now, but they want stickers.
Yeah.
So,
I saw it today. I was driving from Amsterdam here to your place. I actually saw the building, and I have patients who are a little bit older. Older meaning like your late teens. That's older for me, but
right.
who work there. So they do hire a lot of people, and that's what I was thinking about. That Sticker Mule, and they have the distribution centers for Target and such. So there's different employers now. It was very thriving. It seemed like in the first half of the 20th century, and having a love for the community in Amsterdam, being a pediatrician there, it did, just reading about it made me mad, and I wasn't even there.
I remember I can't remember his name, but it was a Puerto Rican gentleman that I interviewed for a column who came here early, before the larger immigration of Latinos, but say he came in 1949 to Amsterdam. And he told me, he said, you could come to Amsterdam in that year, get a job. If you lost the job, you could have a new job the next day. You could walk out of that mill or tell the guy to whatever, take this job and shove it, and go and get another job right away.
There's the Sanford Bigelow mill. That was the other family who had the big
Mansion.
mills. Yeah, and the mansion. Yeah. So these were millionaires. I mean, there was a lot of wealthy people in this area.
That's true. Like that whole strip of Guy Park Avenue going out to St. Mary's Hospital are all these mansions. Yeah. Many of which are still in pretty good shape.
Yeah. Do people still live there? What happens in the mansion?
I think so. I mean, some of them, but some I think have been converted to apartments and so on. But
that makes sense.
They always used to say that Amsterdam had more millionaires per capita than other cities. There's a big kind of history movement in Amsterdam. We have this organization called Historic Amsterdam League, started by Jerry Snyder, a man I interviewed quite a bit, and also Rob von Hasselen, who was the city historian. And they're very active they've had tours of neighborhoods in the city, and they do a tour of the Green Hill Cemetery pretty much every year. Yeah. Walk around the cemetery, and different local folks play the deceased people. They're standing by their grave and so on.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of neat.
Yeah. There's a big push now to make the creek a better attraction. Yeah. The Chuctanunda Creek.
The spot is very important with the history. I mean, the American history, the colonial times, when it came to first the Native Americans, the big groups that were here originally, the Iroquois, and the Mohawks are part of the Iroquois.
That's right. They were, I believe the Mohawk called themselves the Kanya-Kanyaka, and the Iroquois were I believe, Haudenosaunee. I mean, these names that they have are not the names they use, but I'm, trying to be too politically correct here. But yes, the Mohawks, fortunately for them, were on the wrong side of the Revolutionary War. Yeah. So they left, or they were pushed out. They're gone. They pretty much settled up in Canada, the Mohawks. Other Iroquois nations or tribes, such as the Oneida, were able to hang on more in the western Mohawk Valley because the Oneida sided with the Americans, or sided with the rebels in the Revolution.
These are, everything you read about, is like right here amongst us. So it would be a great thing to kind of push that tourism aspect.
Oh, yeah. And in fact, there's a museum in Fort Plain, the Fort Plain Museum, and those folks have been very active. They have an annual conference on the American Revolution. They bring in speakers, authors about books, not just about what happened in upstate New York. I think it's since I've been working with them, it's more clear to me that the American Revolution here and probably all through the colonies was a civil war because there were people that were still loyal to the crown who fought with the rebels, and then even after they were pushed out, they being the people who were loyalists, they would come back and raid the Mohawk Valley, and often accompanied by Mohawk Indians
Yeah.
and some British troops. So it was a very bitter struggle. And the fighting really lasted here until the very end of the Revolutionary War, 1783. I mean, they were still fighting up here.
We have war heroes from 3 different wars, really. So when you mentioned, is it the Green Hill Cemetery?
Yep.
So war heroes from all the wars, right? Or is it more just the...
I think that cemetery was created in the mid-1800s.
Okay.
So there are Civil War burials there. And maybe other people who were from an earlier time were reburied there. If that makes any sense. They were somewhere else, and they brought them there and put them in Green Hill Cemetery.
Yeah, it is a historic landmark. Yeah, I mean, it is a very significant area, and a lot of things that the general population doesn't know or think about. Like something I read one of your books, and the one fact that was very exciting to me as a woman, I guess, Susan B. Anthony was a trailblazer. Everybody's heard of her, but what they may not have realized is that she was the director of the women's department of the Canajoharie Academy, which is also right here.
Yes, I know she taught up in Canajoharie.
Yeah, so that was before she went into the women's suffrage movement.
Well, there's another famous woman from Amsterdam. I think I have her in one of the books, and I credit my friend Jackie Murphy, she was the county historian for a number of years. A woman, I think I'm remembering her name, Leonora Berry. She was a pioneer union leader. There was some question about whether she could stay in the union. The union was called the Knights of Labor. She just sort of rose up and organized women in the knitting mills of the Amsterdam area, and then kind of moved up the ladder in terms of union leadership. Good part of her life, she lived in Amsterdam.
A lot of trailblazers here. The area gives you a sense, because many people came here for freedom or betterment or opportunity, so why not just blaze the trail, right? And do what you can. And the Mohawk Valley, too, I think the Erie Canal is the way to the west, so there wasn't a lot of ways to get past the mountains to go west, so this area was important in that way, too.
Yes, it was and is. I mean, it's one of the few natural breaks in the eastern mountains in America. And first, there was just people going in wagons through, but they go through here. And then the Erie Canal really boosted New York State. And then the railroads followed the same route. And the Thruway follows the same route.
Right.
It's the way to go.
Yeah, it is the way to go. Great. These are these facts that we just kind of driving through take for granted, and it's good to know and remember, because if you don't appreciate the past, like if you don't, I guess, know about the past, you won't appreciate the present, right?
Yeah.
And that's an important point that we should all remember and that we should teach the future generations. I always talk about having opportunity. America's a land of opportunity. Well, we do have a lot of opportunity, and who gave us the opportunity is all of these trailblazers and leaders and people that generations before that did this. So let's continue to appreciate and continue to do more, right? When we were talking about the mills, because I keep coming back to the mills because it's just so intriguing, because the mills became a big part of the World War II effort.
Yes. Yeah, I wrote a column about that, I think, not that long ago. Right. During the war, the military didn't need carpet.
Right.
So the mills turned from making carpets. I presume they still made some carpet, but they wove canvas, which was used to make tents and to cover guns on naval vessels. And this is very poignant, I think. They also made blankets.
Yes.
5 million blankets for the soldiers. And as the author of this little book that was written about this, the book called Smoke, it said men lived in blankets and men died in blankets.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's a lot of the men in the region went to many wars, World War II. I can see their little flags of some of the soldiers from this region. I drive down Market Street to get to work, and you can see they're remembered. So
Yeah.
It's kind of a nice thing. Prior to not being as
Prosperous.
good word, prosperous, as there was parties, there was different things these mill owners did, right, for the employees. But the employees had to work very hard. Like your father was an employee at, like you had stated, at the mill. But with these millionaires around her, was there kind of, how did the laborers feel about these millionaires?
Yeah, well, probably there was imagine there was a lot of resentment. I mean, by the time I came along, it wasn't as, I don't know, pronounced or something like that. There was tension there, I think. I believe my dad really liked working in the carpet mill because he ended up being a weaver. And again, this gets involved in sex differences.
Mm-hmm.
There were very few or no women weavers.
Yeah.
I think Aunt Bocconi does have a story that one of her female ancestors was a weaver in the carpet mills. But in general, the weavers were at the top of the shop people. You know what I mean? Sort of like being a non-commissioned army. They were like the sergeants.
Yeah.
Because my father was in charge of his loom, and he had probably women working for him.
Okay.
Who were what they called creelers, that would thread the loom with yarn, and other people were working on the floor. So he had the responsibility of the loom. Like if they couldn't make carpet on a given day, he'd lose money. Mm-hmm. And he wasn't paid an hourly, maybe he was paid some kind of hourly wage, but his real money came from weaving carpet successfully. He had to leave his loom and pass muster in what they called the finishing room to get credit for it. But in general, they were, I think one time I called them the Jedi Knights of the carpet factory, were the weavers.
It's an important job.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about your family. We talked about your father. And your father's mother, I think you mentioned that she was supposed to be on the Titanic.
Yeah, that's always been the family story.
Yeah, that's pretty neat.
I don't know if it's true, but that's the family story. And the other part of the family story is that one of the reasons was she had a boyfriend in England and didn't want to leave him.
Okay.
But she did leave him and came over to be with my grandfather. Not that he would, I hate to tell bad things about my own family, but I don't remember my father's mother at all. I mean, she died 10 years before I was born. But my grandfather, Harry Cudmore, and I carry his middle name. My middle name is Harry. Harry was a very good weaver, but alas, he was also a very good drinker. And that was kind of typical then of a lot of the men. He would spend a lot of time at this one saloon. They lived on Eagle Street, same street where Kirk Douglas grew up.
Yep.
And Kirk Douglas's father, Harry Dembski, also hung out at this saloon. It was called Shaughnessy's, Shaughnessy's Tavern.
That would be Irish.
Yeah, right. Well, it was Irish. And that's another big ethnic group in Amsterdam was Irish. A lot of them were there in part because of building the Erie Canal. I mean, that was the initial influx, I think, of Irish folks.
That is interesting. It reminds me so much of the novel. It was based on his life story. It was Frank McCourt wrote Angela's Ashes.
Yeah.
And he talked about growing up in Ireland, and his father, unfortunately, also took his wages and went to go to the bars and things. Your mother's mother, you mentioned Margaret Cook. You said Cook was your mother's maiden name. Actually used to feed the soldiers along the Mohawk River.
Yes, this was the time of the First World War.
Okay.
The barge canal, as it was, I think it's actually still called, but the canal that runs through the valley was a new project. It was like the modern thing, to build a big canal like that. It was bigger than the Erie Canal, and it was considered important to national defense. So the Army guarded the canal during World War I anyway. They'd have small detachments of soldiers at each lock. Lock is where they change the level. And my grandmother was in Randall, New York, which is west of Amsterdam, just east of Canajoharie. She fed the soldiers who were guarding that lock and really became quite a favorite of theirs.
Yeah, I bet.
And it was good for her in that her second husband had just died of probably a heart attack or something like that. So she needed some way to support her family. So that's how she supported the family during World War I. War ended. She had no more soldiers to feed and get paid by the government. So that's when they moved to Amsterdam.
Okay.
And then my grandmother opened a boarding house.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she would feed mill workers much as she had fed soldiers.
Oh, yeah. So Margaret Cook was a good cook.
Yes, she was. Well, my mother always said of her mother that she was a cook by both name and nature.
Good. Some people are naturally like to feed and take care of people.
Well, and my mother and her sister, Jane, were both very good cooks.
Oh, good.
You know, it's true. It sort of ran in the family.
Well, so did you pick that up from
No.
them? No.
Nor did it pass on. Well, it did pass on somewhat to my sister. I had one sibling, a sister who was 10 years older. She's long deceased. Yeah, she's also a good cook.
Kind of answers the question. You talked about the rail stations in Amsterdam, and there was a tunnel leading to the station.
Yes, right. Well, right. There was a tunnel under the railroad tracks that you could walk in from downtown Amsterdam, come up on the other side, which was where the train station was. The tunnel was, I always thought, just this kind of scary place, and also it had more than a faint scent of urine.
Yeah.
I mean, it was not very pleasant. I've talked to other people who didn't think it was that bad, but what I would remember doing is with my mother and then with my sister, when we'd pick her up from college, she'd take the train down from Potsdam where she went to college, and then we'd run through the tunnel, and then, as I recall, we would go up to the diner on Chucktanunda Street, or right by the Chucktanunda Creek.
Did you run through because you wanted to pick her up quickly, or because of the stink?
Oh, I think it was because of the smell, and and we didn't know, who was down there.
Oh, yeah, a little concerning. That's true. And then you also raised your 2 kids in Amsterdam as well?
No, I've lived in this house where we're talking for 43 years.
Okay.
So I grew up in Amsterdam. After high school, I went to Boston University, worked a little bit in the radio out in the Boston area, but then my family and I moved to Pittsfield, Mass. That's where the children were born.
Okay.
And where we basically raised them, and then we moved over here. My first wife passed away in 2001, but, after the kids were grown.
Older.
I would just go back to Amsterdam more or less as a visitor, but I would go back a lot because my sister lived farther away. When she was alive, I was the one that kind of, did care for the old folks,
Yeah.
And so I did that. My parents died, and then I had one more aunt that I looked out for, and she died. Actually, she died after my wife died.
A lot of changes.
Yeah.
It's a lot to be said about this area. But did you want to mention Kirk Douglas on this?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I was a great fan of Kirk Douglas. He became controversial in Amsterdam, because in his biography, or his autobiography, The Ragman's Son, he makes the case that Amsterdam was anti-Semitic. That offended some people. But the thing that really irked people was he, in his book, made public an affair he had with one of his teachers. And the teacher was always a great fan of his, helped him, to so on. And of course, she had died by the time that came out. So we only have Kirk's side of the story. But I think Kirk went on to live a good number of years. I think he was humbled by the stroke that he had and became a more caring individual because of that. But he still was one of the leading figures of Hollywood in the 20th century.
Yeah.
And he's from Amsterdam. I remember they had a big Kirk Douglas Day in the 80s. I was working at WGY in Schenectady then. And I remember my parents coming down for it. Because again, my father grew up in a house 3 doors away from where Kirk Douglas lived, the Dembskys. My father was older than Kirk Douglas, so he really didn't know him that well. But my mother, and especially my dear Aunt Vera, who was the last living Cudmore that I took care of, they were friends with Kirk's sisters, of which I think there were 5.
Wow.
You would hang out with the Dembskys quite a lot. Family was called Dembski in Amsterdam, but Kirk ended up wanting to be remembered as being named Danielovich, which I guess was the original spelling of the last name. I know that the Historic Amsterdam League finally was able to get a historic marker, one of those blue and gold markers.
Oh, yeah.
It's at the corner of Eagle and East Main, because the house where the Dembskys lived is still occupied. The house that the Cudmores lived in is kind of, I think it's been torn down even by now, but it declined quite a lot.
You can see that marker when you drive by. I noticed it a few days ago. I mean, that's something. The Fonda family, too, apparently has their roots in Fonda.
Yes, they do. In fact, that's then like Jane Fonda and Henry Fonda and all Peter Fonda. They're all related to the Fondas up in Fonda.
Mm-hmm. And there's so many more. There's you mentioned, and people can hear this on your podcast episodes. There was an artist, Mary Van der Veer.
Mary Van der Veer, yeah. She was quite right. She had certain disabilities, but she was able to paint very well and painted a lot of pictures.
Yeah, and I saw some of them at the museum, too. So, I bring up these things because we need to talk about why is history important. I mean, some people say the past is the past, but it's significant. We should remember the past, and we should teach each other and our children about the past and about history. Well, I have reasons why I feel like it's important, but I wanted to get your view on, because you're very passionate about history. My mother was a history major, so I have some of that in my genes. She loves to read about history and then travel and see the places, and so I guess I got some of that genes from her. Tell me about you and your interest in history and why you think it's important for people to hang on to history and learn about it.
Well, I have nothing really new to offer except that it's, the past, and it's something that I want to know is what happened before we were here, and gives you a perspective on your own life. And also, I just like the story aspect of it. I like telling the stories because it sort of puts us in the frame of mind to be respectful toward what was. And as I get older, I'm almost what was, So I appreciate it when people are kind to me, because they don't have to be. They could say, oh, what difference does it make? I think it does make a good difference. And I've kind of focused more on the more recent past. I haven't really done a great deal about the Revolution or maybe even the Civil War and so forth. But my period of study, or what I'm really interested in, is that Milltown time in Amsterdam and other places where there were a lot of immigrants coming in and they were moving up or moving down. It's important. And I was thinking when you first sat down to do this, that in terms of radio, even when I started back in the 60s, I started in 1962 in WCSS, I remember doing a little history segment on the radio back then. So I've always been interested in it.
Yeah, it's good to have that, because I think some of the things, like you said, it's important for your own life. So putting things into perspective, it does provide an identity of this is who I am, or I'm from, what happened around me, and why I was able to do this. Like when I met you during the panel, I had read the book about, some of the history of women physicians in the past, and it just made me so grateful that I can do something that I take for granted sometimes. Right. Like I was given this opportunity. There was trailblazers that insisted that women become doctors too. If I didn't think about that, I would have thought, well, women are doctors. What's the big deal? Well, it is a big deal. It's a huge deal.
Yeah, it is.
So, you mentioned you like the story aspect. Is that how the term kitchen table history comes to be?
Well, in fact, I even wrote something down about that because I hadn't thought about that in a long time. That was a woman who I interviewed for my second history book, Frances Burnham of Glenville. And I guess I started calling, like you and I are sitting at my kitchen table. And we're talking history. And when I went to see Frances, she's now deceased, she had me sit at her dining room table. And she told me about her relative who was a pilot, an early pilot named Edward Hawley, who came from Gloversville. And it's not the kind of history that, probably changed the lives of the country or anything like that. But to me, it's just interesting.
Yeah.
That he was an early pilot. He died in a plane crash.
Wow.
She has saved all this information about him.
That's how you learn.
Yeah.
Speaking of this, like, I listened to one of your episodes about the Schenectady massacre. So now I'm appreciating the Schenectady area more too, and not realizing that something huge happened in the 1600s.
Yeah.
That kind of changed the face of the area and the people that lived there. I mean, many of them may have ended up in Montreal because of what had happened.
Yeah. Albany and Schenectady were settled way early. I don't think we get credit for that too much.
Yeah, right, exactly.
I mean, but the Dutch were here. They brought the same problems that the English settlers brought to other parts of the colonies. I mean, for example, they were slave owners.
Yeah.
They had African and Caribbean people as slaves and others, but Amsterdam itself isn't that old, or isn't it from that period? Amsterdam wasn't really called Amsterdam until after the Revolution. It was originally called Vettersburg.
That's right.
Or Vetter's Mill. And it was a small settlement. There were settlements in, like where William Johnson was, in Fort Johnson, New York, and up in Johnstown. And he also had built Amsterdam's oldest building, which is Guy Park Manor, for his daughter and her husband, who was also named Johnson. Can't avoid the Johnson name there.
Yeah.
And of course, that's a whole other saga in itself. It was really badly damaged in some of the storms that we had. And that building has been in bad shape. The state owns it, and they're putting it together. And the question comes as to what's going to happen to it. Some in the history community think it would be a good historical building, historical museum of some kind.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I think so. This area, too, well, people, I don't know if they think much about the Underground Railroad, but that's also, we had a lot of spots here.
That is, and other places around here. For example, Canajoharie had a number of African Americans back before the Civil War and after the Civil War. One gentleman I've written about with connection with African American history is Robert, I can't think of his last name now. He was a barber, but his name wasn't Barber. And he was a barber in Amsterdam after the Civil War and was very prominent in African American politics. He went to different conventions and so on and so forth. And another, in fact, this I've been doing the past week or so. For Black History Month this year, I've done another story about the Wilson family. They're very, people of my generation, well known. Others, I'm sure, don't remember them. But the Wilsons were a large family. There were like 8 children. And the father, Harrison Sr., and Marguerite, the mother, they stressed education. And 6, I think, of the 8 went to college or finished college. And you can trace their lineage down through a college president in Virginia to an NFL quarterback, a guy named Russell Wilson.
Okay.
He's now with the Denver Broncos. He was with Seattle for a while. So I'm doing another story about the Wilsons because I've kind of come to know where the Wilson, I never have talked to Russell Wilson, but I've talked to Russell's uncle, who was Benjamin Wilson, who became a big shot lawyer in Washington. He's been feeding me some interesting information about the Wilson family. They were well known in Amsterdam. It was a rather small African-American community, but after World War II, they owned this piece of land behind the East Main Street stores, and they made it a parking lot. So, for example, when we're going to get my sister at the train station, our car could have been parked with the Wilsons.
Oh, yeah.
On, I think it's called Federal Street.
Okay.
And it goes from Chuckton-under Street to Church Street. So there's stories everywhere.
Yeah, there are really stories all around us, and they're all pretty neat. Do you think that we learn from history, or does history repeat itself?
Yeah, I guess it repeats itself, or we don't know, but I think I don't know what to say about it, really. It's better to know than not to know, I would think.
It's better, I think, to pay attention. I do have an opinion about this. I get these strong opinions about things like this, about history repeating itself, because in medicine, for example, the pandemic kind of brought this topic up. And before the pandemic, several years prior, we started getting this anti-vax influx.
Right.
Anti-vax for the COVID vaccine is a little different than anti-vax in general, but it just really personally upset me as a pediatrician. Vaccination is preventative care. And just in the 20th century, it's been less than 100 years, we were still seeing polio. So if it wasn't for the vaccine, every summer we'd worry about polio endemics. So to think that we don't see it anymore, well, it's because we have a vaccine,
right?
And so to forget so quickly, it's so quick. The memory is so short. I think it's parents who are about my age today, maybe they didn't have to see it, but that's not the case.
Well, I mean, again, another story. I have some of my parents' love letters.
Okay.
And my mother would be down in the Catskills, which is where her mother's people came from. And she was writing to my father, we can't go to the movies this week because of polio. In other words, they weren't letting people congregate.
Yes. This concept of social distancing is not new.
No, it isn't.
Right? I mean, the flu pandemic was 100 years ago, and the polio, there would be like pockets, so polio endemics, but it was an international issue. I think at this part, more than sad, it makes me angry.
Well, I can understand it from the point of view of like a physician like yourself,
I guess history repeats itself, but I wanted to also mention a little bit about Nero, because you have the Nero Publishing Company is yours. I don't remember where I read now, but you're one of the top 43,000 authors on Amazon.
Top 43,000?
Yes,
wow.
yes. And that's where you can find your books everywhere, bookstores, Amazon, Walmart, all the big things. Where did the term Nero come from? I know it's the name of your fictional
city, yeah.
Yes, but...
Well, it just sort of came to me. Some of it had to do with goofing around with my sister.
Okay.
We talked about sayings that we'd hear over and over in upstate New York, such as, it's up to you. Mm-hmm. That's like the worst thing you can hear from somebody, because it means that you're now under the gun. If you're wrong, you're going to be blamed for it.
Right.
It's up to you.
Right.
It's up to you. And, well, anyway, so I do have a little backstory about Nero, that it was settled later and all the good classical names like Troy and Syracuse were taken. Mm-hmm. So they picked Nero, not realizing that Nero had been the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned, so he wasn't that good.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was fun writing Nero. I haven't written Nero stuff in decades, probably. Yeah. But that was my first effort at writing newspaper columns in a way.
It's kind of based on like an upstate New York town.
Yeah, and people always would accuse me, you're just talking about Amsterdam, and then get mad about it.
Yeah.
That I was so negative about Amsterdam. But that's the general idea, was that to reflect the negativity that you hear in places like Amsterdam.
So it's not coming from you, but it's coming from the general feeling that you get from people.
It's coming from me.
Right, right.
So, I mean, I'm writing it.
You're the messenger. Final thought, because the pediatrician in me wants to talk about this. When I think about history and I think about how it can actually make you feel hopeful, thinking about what people have done and accomplished. So maybe is history kind of a way to help motivate our youth? I mean, nowadays, the rates of depression and anxiety have skyrocketed. It was pre-pandemic. I know a lot of people blame the pandemic, but it was already happening. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of reasons for that. From your perspective, what do we need to help change this? Is history one of the things?
Well, I'd hope so. It's hard to get young people interested in it, I think. In fact, you may know that the current mayor of Amsterdam, Michael Zinquanti, is also a writer of history.
Okay.
He's written a couple of books about Amsterdam history. And before he embarked on his political career, I'm quite sure he was the one who was telling me that he was hoping to start writing, history books that appeal to young people.
Yeah.
Mine don't. I mean,
yours are easy to read, though. So even if it's not like small children, but I think teenagers and beyond can understand. It's not meant for just history buffs.
No, it isn't. I'm not. In fact, the history buffs and the professional historians, I don't want to be self-deprecating, but they probably find a lot of fault with what I've done. I'm kind of fast and loose. But one of my favorite talks was I talked to a BOCES class, up in Gloversville or somewhere like that. And I thought, oh boy, this is going to be murder, But they were very interested.
I think it can appeal to everybody depending on how you do it. Like if you're presenting it in a class, some people like to listen to podcasts, some people like to read. I think, if we get more programs about history, that'll be neat.
They teach it in the schools to some extent. I mean, like local history. Was it Doug Kaufman? He was a professor, not maybe a professor, but a teacher at Amsterdam High and several others. They teach local history. There's a section on it, but not too much, And that's not the teacher's fault. That's
the curriculum.
The curriculum of.
Yeah, I think getting out there and just making sure history is a part of our lives.
Well, and that's a good point, because I just interviewed for my podcast the author of a book about Edgar Allan Poe.
Yes, I listened to that one.
And I said, why is Poe so popular? He said, well, he's part of the curriculum.
Yeah.
I mean, it's simple. I mean, it's a fascinating story, but for whatever reason, you get him in junior high, you get him in high school, as opposed to X number of other authors they could focus on, but they put Poe. It must be
he made it there, and
yeah. So if they made local history or was able to do it, make that more of the curriculum, just put it there, that would bore some kids to death, but others would pick up on it.
Yeah. I don't know what it was something about history and me reading about it more these past few weeks, inspired by when I met you and then, reading more about what you do and what your works. It made me realize my mood was lifted. Now, why was that? It was just so exciting. Every day I was texting my mother and sister, and we have a group text going, and I would text them these fun facts, and they would say, what's going on with all these facts lately? And I told them that I was about to speak to you. I said, well, I'm reading and learning so much. And so actually my sister is going to start following your podcast too. It made me happy and excited to see things in a different way. So I figured, well, if it can happen to me, maybe it can happen to other people. And just seeing things in a different light gives you a different perspective. Yeah. So that's what I figured. Maybe this can help, and anything helps with the mood crisis we're having, I would call it. Just food for thought. Thank you so much for your time. And bobcudmore.com is where I go.
That's where you find me, bobcudmore.com.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Mother.